I'm Eric Moraczewski. I am the CEO of Nimble Strategies, and Nimble Strategies is the court-appointed receiver over Engraphix. Engraphix is an architectural signage firm that has existed in St. Louis for about 50 years. They had previously been sold in 2021 from the original family that had been operating the entity to a private equity fund out of New York that was interested in purchasing and growing the business here. From that transition though, what they saw was sales declined pretty significantly due to a variety of factors, and by the time we were brought in as a potential receiver and ultimately the receiver, they really were running at about 25% of the revenues from when they had purchased it just a few years before. At the time we were brought in, they were looking, they meaning the plaintiff in the case, Team Shares, was looking at several options for really a wind down. They were looking at this as probably a liquidation. They had been through a sale process trying to sell the business. Ultimately that had failed. The landlord in the case had been extremely difficult to work with and was continuing to be extremely difficult to work with when they had identified a potential buyer for a small amount that would only be interested in acquiring the business and the employees, but did not want to stay within the lease. The state of Missouri has great statute that allows you to cancel and terminate leases, and so they felt that a receivership would give at least that opportunity to work with that potential buyer again. Our first priorities in this as an operational entity were really making the staff understand what was going on and that we were there to support them, not that we were there to just shut the business down or really do anything that was harmful to them. And so we did try to work with them. We tried to help them understand what we were going through a variety of things. We really started out with a lot of the senior team and kind of meeting with them on a regular basis, but also some all-hands meetings that allowed the other staff to ask questions. And some of those questions, my honest answer had to be, I have no idea, but we will look into this for you, because they were asking questions that were very specific to them in their personal interests, and they were fair questions to ask. Questions like, what about our employee stock option plan? Which, when they asked that during the all-hands meeting, was the first time I had heard that existed. And so we did have to go back and really work through questions and answers relating to a lot of what was going on specific to those individuals. I think what we found is that the company had transitioned CEOs 3 times in the last 2 years, and that played a major role in really the development of their sales process, and ultimately there was not anyone out there selling. This was at one point probably the largest brand in St. Louis for architectural signage. It was really one that was utilized quite frequently. In fact, while I was running the renovation of the Arch Grounds, we used them for the signage in the museum at the Arch Grounds. There was just this great base there, and it had fallen away from anything that was going to allow it to grow or to really succeed. And so we had to stabilize the base of it, and then ultimately we had to determine whether that stabilization just meant a shutdown and liquidation like the owner of the company was encouraging, or whether we would go through a sales process. And so we did ultimately decide to go through a sales process for primarily 2 reasons. One, there was not much in assets in the business. There was a lot of very old equipment that wasn't worth much. We figured after paying off an auctioneer, there was probably less than $25,000 worth of assets there. And 2, what would keep people employed, because ultimately we had to care about the individuals that were staffed there and had been working so hard to keep this company afloat. One of the biggest things we had to do was secure some contracts that would keep enough cash flow coming to keep those employees staffed. And so fortunately, we've done a lot of work. My background has been as the CFO of one of the largest museum design firms in the world, so I understood the space very well. And then also the work that I had done at the Gateway Arch Park Foundation, I had a fair amount of relationships in the community. And so bringing in some larger contracts like the Symphony Hall in St. Louis being redone and then all the signage for that allowed the company to have enough work to continue operations while we went through a sales process, and also really gave us, a more recent highlight for a potential buyer to see the value of the company. And so we used that through that sales process to really work towards ultimately gaining a buyer. That said, there was not a ton of interest. We had some people come in from out of town that showed a little bit of interest, but ultimately did not end up being buyers, and that was not who we thought would be a buyer. We thought it would be a local entity. We ended up with 2 offers that we worked through with those 2 buyers. They were very different offers because one of them created a lot of claims in the case, and one of them did not create a lot of claims in the case. And so ultimately we created a scenario that allowed them to bid against each other with their own interests in play. And as they went through that, the entity that was creating that significant amount of claims in the case decided that this was not for them and that they were going to back away from it. In doing so, it left us with 1 potential buyer that ended up closing on the purchase of the entity and moving forward and operating the company. Our marketing process was a lot of outreach to private equity funds, to other people already in the market space, as well as then to our personal networks. So we really tried to hammer those 3 areas because we felt like a private equity fund may see this as an add-on service to something that they already owned. Similarly, someone already in the space might recognize the brand and see it as market expansion, maybe into St. Louis or the Midwest. Or they might see it as a manufacturing facility for, if they're coastal, as one that could be reduced costs. So we had conversations with several groups in those areas, but ultimately we really felt St. Louis recognized and valued the brand more than any other group. And so that was where the majority of our interest came from, with people signing non-disclosure agreements and looking further into the potential purchase of the entity. And that wasn't ultimately who ended up being a purchaser, was a local group. He had a strong understanding of the space. He had been in signage for 10, 15 years. He had an operational entity that was essentially a sales office. And so he had been securing contracts for new signage jobs, but then outsourcing everything, including some to Engraphix during the receivership. And so he saw a true alignment of value in not just being the sales office, but also then the manufacturing side of it and growing his own business. So in turn, he also didn't have redundancy in staff members. He didn't have already 5 other CNC operators that he didn't need a 6th. He didn't have anyone else that was doing the same things as what he was already doing. And so there was no redundancy. It allowed him to continue on with most of the staff that was there, but also continue on with the facilities. So we weren't having to terminate leases. We weren't having to terminate contracts because what was already in place allowed for his own growth. So it was a winning scenario that allowed him to ultimately be successful, but also keep everything in place and not create new claims in that process. We've gone through a lot of discussions with not just the employees, but also with a lot of creditors. And ultimately, this is going to be a scenario where there was no secured creditor, but there are a number of unsecured creditors, and people probably aren't going to be thrilled with what they receive from a payout standpoint. But that number is significantly better than what they would have gotten had we just shut down the business initially, which was the intent of the ownership group at the time. And so while 20% of your claim is not necessarily a great outcome, 20% is better than 0%, which is what they would have gotten. And in some cases, some of them would have had, like the owners had an intent of paying out a severance package to all the employees. So not only would they have gotten 0, it would have actually been a 0 plus a large payment going out to a number of people. So this put them in a scenario where they ultimately end up quite victorious because they're not putting out additional cash as they go through that process. We had a very odd scenario in this case in that we had a landlord who was the former original owner of the business, and really felt he should be the one that got to make all decisions in the case, even though he was just a landlord that had been paid in full and really didn't even have a claim because he had received all his payments on time. And at one point we figured out that he had been in touch with us every 2 to 3 days throughout the whole case, trying to create new issues, trying to create new payments to him, trying to stop us from being able to run our process. And that did create a significant amount of effort from the receivership perspective that wasn't really benefiting the receivership, other than it was protecting it from a bad actor that was not willing to do anything other than support his own self-interest. We shifted from a scenario where we thought this would be shut down within the first 2 weeks of the receivership, and we'd be paying severance payments and we'd be liquidating everything that was involved, to a scenario where we did sell the business as a going concern. And while it wasn't sold for a significant sum, a positive number is always going to be better than a negative number for those claimants. And so we are working to gain as much money for those claimants and seek payment for as large of a percentage of their claims as possible as we go through our claims process. We've ensured that the employees that are there have been able to stay on and have jobs and received salaries and benefits that were at or better than what they had previously. We have an ownership group that, through their claims process, will receive some form of payment back as opposed to paying out severance packages. So ultimately what we've done is all these groups that were in a negative scenario are now in a not 100% scenario, but they're in a positive scenario. And I think that's really what was the true benefit of the receivership for everyone. It doesn't mean it was easy. It doesn't mean that it didn't have opportunities along the way and challenges along the way, but it has resulted in a shift from a very negative position to a positive position, and that's what we were looking for as we went into the receivership. One thing we try to keep in mind with Nimble Strategies is we're not a law firm. We are consultants. We do turnaround work, and so always our key focus is on working with really great attorneys. And in this case, we worked with Spencer Fain. Eric Peterson did a fantastic job of making sure that while there were challenges that may have come up through difficult parties in the case, he was always there to address those issues along the way. So we didn't let anything snowball because he had done such a strong job of preventing it from growing into a bigger issue each step of the way. Ultimately, we've really looked at this case as a challenge. It was not easy. It's not that we were selling something for millions and millions of dollars, and so we also had to operate efficiently in that we couldn't just send in 5 staff members to really gut in and restructure, because there just wasn't the funds in place to do something like that. We had to really look at this as, how do we move quickly and efficiently to bring this to market, to get this sold, and then ultimately to be done with it and move on. And I think we've done the best we can as we went through challenges that were there along the way.